Wonderful. This is an interview conducted by myself, Emma Cieslik, on Friday, February 19th, 2021 at 10 o'clock a.m. for the Muncie LGBTQ plus History Project. I use she, her pronouns. We are recording this video via Zoom while I sit in Burkhart Building at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. I wanted to sincerely thank you so much for your time and your help and for agreeing to contribute to the Muncie LGBTQ History Project. Starting off, would you please introduce yourself?
Uh, my name is Dr. Scott Anthony Amstutz. I live in Muncie, Indiana. I am 38 years old as of yesterday. I was born in Texas, but I grew up in Indiana, and I have lived in Indiana for most of my life.
That's wonderful. And what pronouns do you use?
I use he, him pronouns.
Wonderful. And I know you mentioned that you grew up in Texas. When and where were you born?
I grew up in Indiana, but I was born in Texas. I was born February 18th, 1983, in Harlingen, Texas, which is where my mother was living at the time, and is where my dad grew up. My mother is white. My dad is Hispanic. I am Mexican American. We left Texas when I was 3. My parents were never married. And I grew up in Adams County, which is about an hour north of here.
Yes. And I was curious, would you mind sharing more about your childhood and growing up in Indiana?
Okay. So Adams County is an hour north of here. And that is where my mother grew up. And I think that, after having lived in Texas for a decade, she wanted to escape and she wanted to get out, and she felt that she was in a rut. And I kind of also felt that she felt that the environment there in that part of Texas, the town that I was born in kind of has like a low income and the schools aren't so great, and she wanted to get back to Indiana. And so we came back to Indiana, and my grandmother was alive and living here, and that part of Indiana that I grew up in is particularly very conservative. Yeah. Bern, Indiana is home of the largest Mennonite church in the United States. Used to be home of the largest Mennonite church in North America, but I think sometime back in the 80s, they built a bigger one in Canada somewhere. And so I say Mennonite, and immediately people think Amish. Those are old Mennonites. These Mennonites certainly evolved from the old Mennonites, and the town I grew up in Bern and Geneva, Indiana. There are lots and lots and lots of Amish. There certainly are out there in the rural areas, but the Mennonites that belonged to the Mennonite church in town was, we'd call them Numinis, which might be a pejorative term, I guess. And they were very, conservative Christians who I think still fell underneath the Anabaptist umbrella. They had cars, they had electricity. Some of the women would always wear dresses. Some of the women might wear some sort of like hairpiece or something, some sort of like a bonnet or something. But some of the men had facial hair, but they were certainly yeah, they had electricity. They're not like Amish, right? Like the reality TV Amish. Okay, no, they're not like that. And so the town, Bern had like 3 traffic lights. Okay, I think the town Geneva, which is about 4 miles away, I spent most of my childhood living in these two towns, and they were incorporated into one school. And I went to that same school, K through 12, and I was the only person in my school that was not white. Okay, and I know that I realized that people are like, oh, but you are white. Well, you know, when you when you're half Mexican American, my dad is Chicano, Tejano, and I don't know. It's interesting. Sometimes I pass and sometimes I don't. And they were mostly these blonde hair, blue eyed little Hitler Youth kids, and I stuck out pretty bad. And uh, So yeah, the town was very small, uh, very religious, um, and I think that my mother, being an unmarried woman, raising a child, and then that child was not perceived as being white enough. Um, I think it really scared the hell out of her, and such. So my mother was very um, open-minded, and progressive. She had lived different places. She had met different people. She got out of the cornfields, and she was sort of more evolved, what have you. And so interesting that my house inside my home, when I was home, um, was a safe sort of place where um, ideas and questions were very much embraced. And my mother was very practical about lots of things. My cat is sitting on the keyboard. Okay. Um, um, and such. And so I remember like my mother, you know, how you teach sex to children. I don't know how good of an idea this was, but my mother's solution was to get a textbook, an anatomy textbook, like from a community college that she had. And it was just like what you would use if you were taking biology 101 or anatomy 101. And it was just like, here you are. This is the human body. These are fallopian tubes. These are testes, and this is a fetus, and this is how this works. And it was very like, there was nothing mystical about the act of sex, and nothing, what have you. And the textbook was probably published in the late 70s, right? And it was a paperback textbook. And I do remember there was a little paragraph somewhere, because there was like a little subsection that talked about the psychological aspects of sexuality. And there was like a little paragraph, and it said something about how homosexuality does exist. There are people who are sexually attracted to the same sex. This is a group of people who are often maligned by society. And that's all it said. And it was just a little paragraph. And it wasn't like casting a judgment in any way, but it was certainly just making note, like, okay, these people do exist, and within our society they are mistreated, I guess. Um, and 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 that was that. It sort of just left it at that. um, and So the town was very conservative, and I kind of just stuck to myself, and I very much had this idea in my head that like this is not home. I'm not from here. I don't look like all of you. And because I don't look like all of you, and because I'm not from here, I'm not one of you. And that's kind of, in some ways, I feel gave me permission to say to myself, therefore, I don't have to think like any of you. Right. And I now have permission to, I don't have to conform. It's ridiculous to expect me to conform to all of you because I am not one of you. And so these small minded burdens that you are putting onto yourself, well, I'm exempt from that. And, a squirrel can adopt a duck, but that doesn't mean that the duck is going to wind up acting like a squirrel. And so I just feel like I'm an adopted member of this community, and I am exempt from all your rules. And um, I was very, I had senioritis when I was like 8 years old. I was like, there's a big world out there, and I need to graduate, and I need to get the hell out. And that is happiness. Happiness is, I don't care if I'm rich, I don't care if I make lots of money, I don't care if I'm famous, I don't care if I have my dream job. I just happiness is about having a life and leaving this place. And so um I was very much concentrated on that. And I say there's negative aspects of it, but there was also lots of positive aspects in some ways. I have to admit that that they were all, the town is sort of wealthy in some ways. So, and they do appreciate the, they're sort of different than sort of lots of other conservatives. They are certainly not your Trump conservatives. I feel like they are more like your Ronald Reagan conservatives. And they are sort of like Mike Pence's and Dan Quayle's backyard. Dan Quayle's from Huntington, which is just like a county or two over, right? It's no big deal. And so they highly prized education, and they prized uh, talent and skill. Um, and so if you were a man, you didn't have to like work with your hands and complete acts of masculinity in order to prove yourself. If you played an instrument, if you could sing, if you enjoyed reading, if you had an understanding and appreciation of the humanities, philosophy, and the arts, um, then that was good. You're supposed to be smart. You're supposed to get good grades, and you're supposed to be kind. And so they were very much all about those types of things. And so the school was well funded. We had lots of stuff at school. There was lots of extracurricular activities. There was, the band director wasn't like scrounging for money to keep the band going, or anything like that. And there was plays and there was musicals, and my God, we read so much Shakespeare. And if you were in plays, or if you were in musicals, or if you had musical talent, you weren't deemed a sissy, or anything like that. Uh, and within their community, they sort of nurtured cultural appreciation, in that they're in that Mennonite church, they had a choral society where for over 100 years they have been getting together and they have been singing Handel and Bach and Brahms and Haydn and such, and uh, all that stuff. And so all that kind of certainly appealed to me, and sort of worked in my favor. And in some ways, I kind of was a little golden boy. I graduated with 115 kids, and I was winning awards and stuff like that for music. And so that was sort of like very nurturing in many ways. The other thing about them is that they were very passive. they're very, and I guess this must be from their Mennonite roots. I was not bullied in school. Nobody threatened to kick my ass. Nobody, threatened violence, and I wasn't pushed around, or they were not. In addition to not being physically confrontational, they were not verbally confrontational. So like people didn't like call me names and stuff like that. And um, I think because I came out at a very young age, in many ways, me acting outside of their norms was by them perceived as an act of aggression, because they were very non-aggressive and they were very passive. And the fact that I was openly um, defiant of their norms, I think they perceived as being almost a violent attack on them. And so I think I was very much aware of the fact that I was gay, certainly by elementary school. I knew I was. And I remember being young enough and being attuned enough that I understood the fact that I was gay, and I also understood that I can't tell anybody, because if you're this young and you tell people, they are going to, I don't know, lock you up. They're going to, try to get you to talk to a psychiatrist, or they're going to perceive that you're, I don't know, I thought they would think I was crazy, or they wouldn't believe you or whatever. So I literally knew and did not say anything and kind of kept it to myself. Um, and I started telling people in sixth grade. And by the time junior high came around, by the time we called seventh and eighth grade junior high, and then ninth through 12th was high school. And by seventh grade, eighth grade, certainly, everybody knew. The principal knew, all the teachers knew, all the kids knew. And I was not hiding it, whatever. And I feel like the kind of ridicule I did get from them was, because there was certainly lots of judgment. I know I'm saying that they weren't, okay, I wasn't bullied and they weren't like verbally violent, but they certainly were very condescending and very judgmental. And it was sort of like, have you ever seen the movie Saved?
Yes.
Macaulay Culkin.
Yes.
That is the town I grew up in.
Yes.
That is those people. Absolutely. They would at lunchtime, they would let the youth pastors into lunch, into the school, and the youth pastors from the different churches, and there were lots of churches, would hang out with us, and they all act like that guy.
Yes.
There are all these like 30-some-year-old, late 20-some-year-old young dads with stonewashed jeans and button-ups from Macy's, very, very basic white guys with $10 haircuts, and hanging out with us and just trying to be cool, whatever. Just reeked with effort. Just reeked with effort. And there was always these young, we'd come back to school in the fall, and over the summer, Tiffany in eighth grade went to Christian camp that summer, and she got saved. And so now she's back at school, and it's September, and she's just on fire with God's grace and love. And immediately she seeks out the town homosexual and very graciously takes him into the hand and tries to very, very generously, very compassionately have a conversation with me about how she and I need to pray so that way she can save my soul. And it was sort of that, like they're very, I'm sure they felt that they were being very kind and, whatever. And I'm just like, no, And I think at that time, I was just like, no, you're 15 years old, you're 14 years old. You don't know anything about lust, really. And you don't know about, the expanses of the human heart and such. And I'm not going to take advice from you on my sexuality. That's because what do you know, Tiffany? Okay, you know. Um, and such. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of like the occasional intervention
Yes.
that was going on. That was very compassionate and what have you, um, and such. And so yeah, I graduated in 2001, and I don't go back there. I certainly don't go back there, and I don't really talk to any of them. Um, there might be one or two people who I graduated with. Actually, there aren't anybody I graduated with that's on my social media.
Which schools did you graduate from? I'm curious what their names were.
Okay, well, K through 12, I was in the same system. Bern and Geneva consolidated. And so I lived throughout, we moved a couple of times, but from the age of 3 to the age of 18, I lived in Southern Adams County, in Bern and or Geneva, between those two. And the entire school is incorporated and it's called South Adams High School. It's called South Adams Junior Senior High School. Yeah. Do you know it?
The name is very familiar. I have definitely friends who are from the area.
Oh, really? Probably. Okay. So yeah, so I did that K through 12. Um, that's pretty much my childhood, really. That's encapsulated.
Yes. And I was curious, I know you mentioned that you came out at a young age. Who did you come out to first, and what was that experience like?
I imagine that I think I knew that nobody is going to keep this a secret. And once you tell somebody, it's going to just happen. I think I don't think there was this is it. Like, I don't think this was like a person that I can remember. Like, I think this must have been some of my friends at the time. And I think that they were probably I think we were young enough that they were like, okay. And I don't think they realized what all that meant until sometime later.
That makes sense. And I was curious, I know you mentioned your mother and father and your grandmother. Would you mind sharing more about your family of origin?
Okay. My parentage is a little weird, that's for sure. When I was born, my mother was 30 and my father was 18. Okay. I don't I I don't know what the age of consent laws are in Texas, but if they were breaking the law, I would not be surprised. There was this huge age difference between them. My mother was married and divorced before she met my dad. They never married. And by the time I was 3 years old, they had broken up. And we and so then we moved to Indiana, and I'm not exactly sure what you mean by origin. You mean
Your biological family as well as your social family and those that you surround yourself with?
like their origin? You mean
I was really curious what people had significant roles in your life. So I know you mentioned your grandmother, people that really impacted you.
okay? Well, certainly my mother. My grandmother died when I was like in sixth grade. Um, she I guess I kind of have a link to her because she was, out of everybody in our family, she was the only one besides me that was musically talented. She was the only one that played an instrument. She's the only one that could read music. And she was a the church accompanist at her church for decades. And she died when I was in 6th grade. We were not terribly close, though, I must admit. I don't know. She was a very quiet person, and so I don't really feel, at the time that she died, I didn't really feel a huge emotional connection to her. And my mother was very close to her mother and was very devastated when my grandmother died. My dad was not really a part of my life in general. And I would assume that a lot of that is because he was a very young father and he was not responsible. And, he does have a narcissistic personality. And so he's never really been a part of my life. He was sort of like in and out and not a mainstay. He certainly never stayed around long enough for me to feel a sense of dependability and to emotionally connect with him, really. And my mother never married, and she was single for most of that time. She had relationships, but nothing really permanent. And so, I mean, there was never like a stepdad or anything like that. I think that the people who were around me, who kind of I connected to, would have mostly have been my teachers. I had a cello teacher who was a very dear man who died when he was 90 years old and I was 15. And really, he was like my best friend. He was like the most important person, easily one of the top 3 most important people in my life. I had a voice teacher who was a recent college graduate who was living there in town, and she kind of like took his place. He died when I was 15, and then I shortly thereafter started studying with her, and through most of my young adult years, we were good friends. I had a very good friend growing up who was like a brother, and his parents were very nurturing, and I spent a lot of time at their house, and I would say that his parents were sort of like my parents in many ways. Yeah, my mother had siblings, and I had cousins, but I was never really close to any of them. My mother was sort of like the black sheep of the family because my mother left. She did marry and did divorce. The man she married was also Hispanic and he was Catholic. I think that really freaked them out. And then she comes back from Texas with this half Mexican kid, and I think that freaked them out. And so, no, was never close to any of them.
I'm
Very
really
much like,
curious.
what?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm very much I was, my mother was a single working mom.
Mhm.
I was a latchkey kid. Absolutely. I was very much on my own, like most of the time. I was, by the time 4th grade rolled around, I was getting up on my own because my mother was working 10-hour days. And so I would wake up like at 7 o'clock. I had an alarm. I would wake up and I would get dressed and go to school. My school was like a block away from my house. And I was very much, by the time like 4th grade rolled around, I was very much on my own. And I would get off of school and I would come home, let myself in and hang out. And I remember my mother being very stern and telling me, okay, this is a key to the house. Don't lose it. Okay. And 2, don't show it to anybody and don't tell anybody what we're doing, because if they found out that you're on your own, they will take you away from me. And that was what she kind of like instilled that into me. And that was sort of a compromise because I had a babysitter and I hated them. I had a babysitter and my babysitter was okay, but they had 3 kids and their kids were so annoying. And I'm like, I will do anything if you will not make me hang out with those people anymore. And yeah.
What were the names of, I know you mentioned your cello teacher, and I know you have a wonderful musical history, the other musical teacher you discussed?
My cello teacher's name was Dr. Freeman Burkholder. And he had a very long and interesting life. And he was a very kind man. And I think I met him when I was like 11, 12 years old. And that was a huge, like, you can be a doctor in music. I had no idea. This huge realization. And obviously had a huge, impact on me, and was probably the reason why I got a doctorate in music. And my voice teacher's name, her name was Kelly Liechty. Her name isn't Kelly Liechty anymore. She got married, and for she changed her name because when you get married you have the option to change your name, and she completely changed her name. She not only took her husband's last name, but she sort of changed her first name for professional reasons because she thought it would sound better as an opera singer. And so now I think her name is Diana Kelly Eiler, is I think her, it's either Diane or Diana. I think it's Diana Kelly Eiler, Eiler. She lives in Wisconsin.
That's wonderful. And I was curious, going along with that, I know you mentioned that you grew up in a community with a very strong Mennonite presence. Did you grow up in a religious family? Did you practice religion as a child?
Kind of yes and no. My grandmother was, the church accompanist, and my grandmother was very much a tabernacle Methodist. And she was certainly very practicing. As a child, my mother, I mean, it's just sort of weird that like my community was very much this way, but my house was honestly like its own little um, uh, culture altogether. My mother was not a religious person, particularly. Not to say that she didn't believe in God. I mean, if you were to ask her what her religion would be, she would just say that she's just Protestant. Um, you know, but she wasn't a very strong practitioner of religion. So she never made me go to church, and she never went to church. I think she just, she worked, 40, 50 hours a week. And yeah, she was just going to stay at home on Sunday. Um, However, though, I quickly figured out at a young age that getting involved with churches was a great way to find, to supplement music education, because they appreciated music in this town, and there was so many churches. And so if you wanted to get involved, that was an easy way to get involved. And so I was in um, that Mennonite Choral Society. I was in various church choirs and things like that. And I was going to church very regularly on my own from the age of 13 to 18. And these were all Protestant churches. And I really only went for the music. I was not interested in the religious aspects of it. And I would often take a book and sort of hide it in my choir robes and sit back there. It's awful. I'm 16 years old in Bern, Indiana, and I'm in the back row, reading Anne Rice in the middle of this this church sermon. I was totally inappropriate. But no one said anything, right? No.
Most definitely. And I was curious, I know you mentioned at your school that you received sex education at home. Was there anything that you received about homosexuality and the LGBTQ community from Bern, Indiana, where you lived? From the
No.
church or from school?
No. No. Would not. I think we did have, like, the sex ed I remember. I want to say it must have been like in sixth grade. They separated the girls and the boys, and all of the boys. We went into the gym, and they had like a TV screen, and that was just to show us like basic pictures of like anatomy or whatever. And they just sort of like talked about puberty, and they just sort of talked about um, you know, how a baby is made, whatever. But there was no discussion on condoms. There was no discussion on homosexuality at all. And I think like in health class in eighth grade, that topic may have been reviewed, but there was no discussion on homosexuality. There was no discussion on condoms or safe sex at all.
Yes.
I remember being like in eighth grade and like, is this it? Is this all we're getting? We're not going to talk about anything else here. And I remember being like sad. I remember looking around at these other kids and just being like, oh, this is not going to work out well for any of you. And I remember looking at my teacher. This is like, and of course it's hilarious because health class was taught by the gym teacher, right? And so I'm looking at my eighth grade gym teacher and I'm looking at him and I'm wondering, maybe he doesn't know there's more than this. Like, is this the limit for you? Like, okay, I don't know.
Most definitely. And going along with that, I know that you mentioned that you had experienced musical history and musical experiences and making at a young age. Would you mind sharing more about your college experience and how you came to study music at the higher level in education?
hmm I always knew I was going to. I always knew I was going to study music. Obviously, I took a year off between high school and college, and I moved out of state with a friend, and I lived like a heathen for like a year. I then was like, okay, I need to go back to college, and so I went to Ball State because it was cheap, and I was kind of happy with my choice for Ball State because um, the music composition, because my major was music composition, was a very small program. There weren't that many of us, and there were like a whole bunch of music composition, music theory professors, and they were all very friendly. And um, I got along very well with my music composition professors, and the so I did my bachelor's, and I went on and did my master's, like directly. I finished my bachelor's in like May of 2007, and then in June of 2007, summer session 1, I was in graduate school. Like I just boom went right into my graduate studies, and after I finished my master's, they needed somebody to teach classes, and so I adjunct for a year, um, and then I met my now husband, and I applied to get my doctorate at the University of Arizona. And I applied at other places, but the University of Arizona was willing to give me an assistantship. And I knew there was a pipeline between Ball State and the University of Arizona. I had known other composition majors who had left and gone and did their graduate work at U of A. And so I kind of followed that pipeline, and he and I moved to Tucson, and we lived there from 2010 to 2014, and I did my doctorate. So I was like in school, like I took a year off between high school and college, and I took a year off where I adjuncted between my master's and my doctorate. But like I was in school from like kindergarten until the end of my doctorate, pretty much straight through. And in 2014, I was sick of school. And yeah.
And I'm curious, I know you mentioned that you attended Ball State. When you attended Ball State, what did the LGBTQ plus community look like at Ball State and in Muncie?
I can't say much about Muncie. Muncie has changed so much. Um, when I was in my undergrad, I mean, it's kind of weird because you're in the music department. There are gay people everywhere. Okay, half the faculty is gay. Okay, and uh, there was and there still is, an organization at Ball State, Spectrum, which I was my sophomore year. I was the vice president, and it was more like a social group, really. And I feel like the university gay life was very was a pretty well-sized group. There was a bunch of us, and we all knew each other, and pretty much all of the gay kids, regardless of your major, we all knew each other, and we all hung out a lot. And every weekend there was always a house party. And so, I mean, I went to so many parties, so many house parties, and it was all very mixed. And they're really, like, the whole trans thing hadn't yet really become mainstream, so there really wasn't any out trans people at that time. Um, Later on, I found out that some of those people came out as trans. But from 2002 to 2007, my undergraduate years, it was lots and lots of house parties pretty much every weekend. And the gay guys and the lesbians, we all hung out together. You know, there wasn't much of a division. I feel like certainly in many times in gay culture, there's this separation between the lesbians and the gay men. But with us, it was all very mixed in together. Yeah,
How did people know about the house parties? Was it word of mouth or was it Spectrum?
it was word of mouth. Sure, it was word of mouth. The house parties were not at all officially sanctioned by Spectrum, but everybody was there. I mean, you know, oh yeah, the executive board was at every party.
And I'm curious, were they held? I knew you said a house party, so likely off campus. They were held off campus.
Yes, they were held off campus. No, you don't party in campus. That's stupid. You'll get caught. No, no. You didn't really hang out in people's dorms. Not if you plan on drinking. And yeah, like everybody was drinking. We were all underage, and we were all drinking. I don't even remember where the alcohol came from. I'm assuming I was giving money to somebody and they were getting it for me, but I don't remember who that was. When I was 21, I don't remember buying alcohol for anybody, but it was always there. And yeah, it was through word of mouth. It was interesting. I Looking back on it, I mean, it seemed to, at the time it just seemed to be a given, but now that like I'm looking back on it, like, oh, how strange that we were all very sort of, at least socially organized. And this is before, I mean, Facebook didn't really become a thing until like 2006, maybe 2005. And so, I mean, my freshman, sophomore, junior year, I mean, I never really got on the MySpace train. MySpace was certainly very popular. I think we must have just been texting each other. But there was always a party, and it was always easy to find out where it was at. And it was always like an open guest list. And it was always like somebody's apartment, or it was somebody was running a house or something.
Yes, and I'm curious, what types of events did Spectrum host? I know you were involved as a very high up executive board member.
Um, Things that we did. Well, my God, we did a drag show like every semester. There was a drag show every semester, and part of my job was to organize it. And um, so that was usually held like in the student center somewhere. It was often held like in ball gym, and it was a nightmare. Okay, from my perspective, because I had to organize it. And God, what else did we do? We had a representative on the SGA. Um, we had we had weekly meetings. We met every Thursday, and usually we would have like a guest speaker or some sort of activity. Um, we would also trying to remember what was the other things that we would do. We made a float for the homecoming parade. So we were in the homecoming parade every year. Um, I think that really is about it. I think we sort of like kept to ourselves.
And I'm
Yeah.
curious, I know you mentioned the drag shows. Were there people who were brought in to perform drag? Were they students? And did they go on to perform drag elsewhere?
Most of them were members of Spectrum. Um, Very few people came outside. There may have been a couple of people who were like in Muncie who took part. We usually, every time we did a drag show, there would usually be one headliner, and that would usually be. I was not involved with that aspect of it. There was usually somebody who one of the other drag queens knew of an up and coming drag queen, and it would be she's from Cincinnati, or she's from Indy, or she's from Chicago or St. Louis, and she would come in and she would be our headliner. And usually all the money, because we did tips, all the money went to some sort of charity. Um, we gave it to some group or something. And Except for the headliner. The headliner who came in, her tips were her own, okay, because she traveled in, okay, and she would certainly get most of the tips, okay, and then everybody else saved their tips, and it all went to like moms or something like that. And I'm trying to remember. We also did speaker panels. That was somebody else's job to arrange those. And so basically, like, you know what the speaker panels are, you probably already do. Okay, so we did that where people would go out and talk to like anthropology classes and psychology classes and things like that.
What were some of the themes of the speaker panels? Was it usually executive board members who spoke to people?
It was anybody in Spectrum who wanted to be involved, and we certainly. It was kind of weird because you could come to Spectrum, but you didn't have to out yourself. And so if you're there and you're hanging out, and if you wanted to talk about, you know, are you gay? Are you bi? Are you questioning? Are you just a straight ally? You didn't have to if you didn't want to. But the one person, the one executive that was in charge of arranging the speaker panels, if you wanted to be on the speaker panel, then you needed to email them, and you would need to privately tell them how you identify, because when they made speaker panels and they sent them out to various classes, they would try to make a diverse group. Okay, and so we're not just going to send all gay men out. Okay, so you're going to need to have some mixture in there from different perspectives and different, like racially diverse and what have you. And they would try to do that when they coordinated that. And there wasn't really ever a theme necessarily.
And I'm curious, I know you mentioned that they were trying to incorporate a mixture of people into the classes. How did different people identify in Spectrum? I know you mentioned that there were individuals who identified as lesbian or gay. Were there gender fluid individuals or transgender individuals?
Looking back on it, I can only remember there was one guy who was a trans man. And I don't remember any other trans people or any other gender fluid people or non-binary people. Later, I found out that some of those people came out later. But at the time, they were not. And I just think they hadn't yet explored that aspect of it. And I think that they weren't, I don't think the trans issue, that type of information was not as available then as it is now. And so I think a lot of them were just like completely unaware that that was an option for them. So no, most of us were gay and lesbians. I think there was probably like some people who identified as bisexual.
Yes. And I know you mentioned that you put on many different events. Were there any ever homophobic responses to Spectrum or the drag show that you remember?
No, the drag shows were usually pretty popular, and the drag shows were usually very well attended. The sorority girls loved coming to the drag shows, and they would drag their boyfriends. And I would say, like, at a typical drag show, 65% of the audience was straight. I think there was occasionally when we would be in the parade and we would march in the parade. I think occasionally there would be somebody would yell some offensive remark or something. I think that was largely frowned upon by the other parade goers. Yeah. Ball State life is not very, it was sort of hilarious. And I always knew this was the case. And I certainly experienced it when I went to the University of Arizona. University of Arizona has a very vibrant Greek life, okay? And the frats at Ball State are really pathetic compared to Greek life at other universities. And I remember at the University of Arizona, they would have, whatever process they go through when they select their new members. And you would see all of these people dressed up, waiting to go to these formals and things like that. And I remember particularly the guys, I was just like, there was no way that any of the Ball State frat guys would be able to come to the University of Arizona and rush in any of these frats, because there was no way they were going to take them. There's just no, like, every single one of these men and women could be a model. There's just no Greek life at Ball State. You're far too fugly to be in Greek life at a real school. It's just not gonna happen. So I don't know. There's not a lot, like, Ball State doesn't have like that kind of like campus toxic masculinity that you see at other places.
Yes, and I'm curious, I know you mentioned straight allies. Were there many straight allies in Spectrum?
Yes, there was several. For the longest time, the acting president of Spectrum was heterosexual. There was one, oh gosh, there was one girl, her name was Tabitha. I do not remember her last name. And she identified as straight. And there was another lady, this young lady named Anita, who was an African American woman who I'm still friends with on Facebook. I forget Anita's last name. She lives in Indy. She was president for a while. Yeah. So, I mean, you had straight allies on the executive board.
Yes, and I know you mentioned classes and forums that were and panels that were put together. What were the reactions to the panels that were coming into classes? Were there any common questions that got asked?
I mean, the panels were mostly us uh, talking about our coming out stories. I don't really remember any particular I think like a lot of the common questions were stuff like, um, do you want to get married? Do you want to have kids? Gay marriage was not yet legalized. And I think that they would ask questions like that. Do you want? I felt like most of the time the students were trying to ask questions because they wanted to find commonalities between us and them. Um, and, how do you meet people? That was mostly the kinds of questions we would get. Um, I guess because it's a classroom and people felt to mind their manners, a lot of people, nobody ever said anything particularly rude or anything. I remember I was on a speaker panel. I remember a couple of instances, a couple of strange instances. One instance that was really strange is there was a guy, and I think this was a graduate class. And so this guy, I mean, I don't have no idea how old he was. He could have been in his 30s or 40s, right? He was a graduate student. And I'm like 17. And he's there asking me these questions. I'm not 17. I'm like, 19, 20 years old. And he's there asking these questions. And I remember on that panel, I was the only gay man on that panel. And he asked me, if I think right, I think this was like the classes that you take when you want to be a social worker. Okay.
Yes.
Whatever those classes are. So he was probably studying to be a social worker. And he asked me, he says, have you ever had a conversation with a doctor about how being a homosexual might be unhealthy? And have any doctor ever told you that? And I was sort of thinking, and I'm like, well, um, statistically speaking, gay men are at a higher risk of contracting HIV. But, if you use condoms and protection, this was before PrEP, any pharmaceutical thing like that. And, that can easily be avoided, what have you. And he was like, no, that's not exactly what I mean. I mean, I just kind of wonder. And you could see that he wasn't trying to be disrespectful or rude, but he was seriously just asking. He's like, do you ever have you ever considered that the act of homosexual sex could be harmful to your body? And I realized, like, oh my God, you're asking me if I engage in sodomy, do I worry about being incontinent or somehow getting hemorrhoids or something? And I had to explain to him, it's like, no, if you do, like, first of all, there are plenty of people who are not gay men who engage in anal sex. Okay, there's lots of straight people who are having anal sex, and no, you're not, unless you're doing something particularly crazy. I don't think you're going to. I think he was wondering if that would cause incontinence or something. Like somehow, if you just shove enough dicks up your ass, you're just going to just let loose your bowels or something. I don't know what he was thinking, what have you. Um, I was trying to answer it in this way, and I remember I think the professor of the class got a little offended by my comment because I think she was like, "Are you saying?" Because I was trying to say that, well, on average, I feel like gay men probably take better care of their health than straight men, and she was like, I think she thought I was being like discriminatory or prejudiced by saying that, and I just simply had to say to her, "Well, you're talking about a class of men who are free to perform are free to pursue education however they want. They have all the privilege of being men, particularly if they're white men, they have all of that privilege, and they are able to pursue their career and their educational opportunities, and they are not expected to take care of their partner, nor are they going to produce children. Okay. And so you're looking at a whole class of men who have a disposable income. And with that extra income, they are able to, and not to mention free time, well, yeah, they can eat right and go to the gym and get plenty of sleep and have vibrant social lives. And they don't have to take care of a wife or raise children. And so, therefore, on average, I would say that gay men are more interested in their self health than and I thought it was so strange. Like, I have to explain this to you, right? You're the professor, right? Um, so disposable income, right? Yeah.
Yes. And going along with that, I know you mentioned that you are married, and I was curious, did that happen before, or when did that happen in your life? Were you in Muncie when you were married?
So I met my husband in 2010, um, and I had been very single um, through all of my undergrad and my master's. I was purposefully so. I was really not interested in having a relationship. And so it's a little weird. My husband is the first adult relationship I've ever had. It's a little weird. I certainly played the field extensively. Um, I was very much had a strong online presence, and I was having lots of one night stands and what have you. Um, but I was not really getting involved with anybody. And he and I met online, and it's a little strange. I had already decided to go to the University of Arizona and get my doctorate. I had already applied, I had already been accepted. And so we met in April of 2010. And I had told him when we were talking online before we met, this is what I'm doing, this is what's happening in my life. And I was flying out there to meet the professor I was going to be studying with and sort of like look around and see what it was like out there. And so I was out there for 3 days, and I flew back, and I had made arrangements with him that I need a ride home from the airport. So he was living out of state at the time, but he was finishing his master's at Miami of Ohio
Yes.
in Oxford. And so he 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 came to the airport and he picked me up, and so we met at the Indianapolis airport. And this is the first time I'd ever met him. And I got in his car and he drove me home to Muncie. Um, and that might seem a little weird, but honestly, we had been talking online for years, really, on and off again. And so he picked me up and he took me home, and we spent the weekend together. And it was pretty immediate. He was all about like having some sort of like a long-term relationship. That's definitely what he wanted. And I was just like, okay, again, I'm moving to Arizona. It's April. I plan to move in June, maybe July. You can come with me if you want. Right. And I think that really freaked my friends out. My friends were freaked. They were like, what do you mean Anthony has a boyfriend? And they're living together and they're moving across the country. And I remember one of my friends kind of sat me down and was like, okay, you're 27 years old. You've never had a serious relationship. You met this guy, you just met him, okay, and you are already going to move in together across the country and start your doctorate all at the same time. New location, new degree, new relationship, all at once. And I'm trying to fight my cat. And I think she was just really, really freaked out. And they were placing bets. They were placing bets on how all this was just going to explode in my face. Whatever. And we did that. July came around and we loaded up his car with our stuff and we drove to Arizona. And so I was doing my doctorate and he started his second master's degree. Yeah, that's how that happened. We got married in 2017. The date of our wedding was the same as our anniversary day. So we have one anniversary.
Oh.
And so it's April 10th, and we met on the 9th. We decided to start dating on the 10th. And so our wedding was on the 10th, and it was just it's simple that way.
That's wonderful. And I was curious going along with that. I know that you've lived in Muncie and you came back to Muncie after your doctorate. When did you come back to Muncie?
We came back in 2014. I finished my orals and he finished his master's degree, and living in Tucson. Tucson's a lot cooler now. I should have stayed, I guess. I hear in the last 6 years, Tucson is sort of like the next Portland, Oregon, right? It's become like this hipster, cool hangout place to be. But when I was there, it was deadly. It was scary, deadly. I mean, you felt like the environment was trying to kill you. There was so much poverty. There was so much economic disparity. And I was like, yeah, and that when you go there, you'd meet these people and it was, oh my God, it could be so depressing. You would meet these people and everybody had a story. And the story was, well, I moved here to come to school. I got married and I moved here because my spouse's family was from here, or I came here for a job or whatever. And then at some point, that all fell through. They got divorced, they dropped out of school, they lost their job, and now they're all stuck and everyone's trying to leave. And that was the common story, was that I live here, but I'm too broke to move and I want to get out. And we were just terrified. Now that we finished school, what happens if we can't find jobs? What happens if we're stuck and we can't leave, right? And it was just like, I've heard this story so many times before. And so we decided to, my cat is looking at birds. We decided to leave as soon as possible. So we loaded up the car and we just drove back. And that was 2014. And he very quickly, his second master's degree was in library science. And I knew the director of Muncie Public Library. And so I introduced him and he got hired real quickly. We moved back in July. It's so strange. We have this same date thing keep on happening. The day that we moved there, 4 years later, was the day that we left. And that was by accident. We were in the car, we were driving from Tucson, and we were leaving Tucson for the last time. And he says, I realized this morning that it was 4 years ago today that we got here. And I had not been paying attention. So we left, we were there exactly 4 years. And so we drove. It was July of 2014 that we got back, and I want to say like by September he had a job at Muncie Public Library. So that kind of moved pretty quickly.
That's wonderful. And going along with that, I was curious. I know that you expressed your own identity. How have you seen the Muncie LGBTQ community change? I know you went to Ball State and then you came back now. How have you seen that change over time?
Um, there was when I lived in when I was at Ball State, there was a huge rift between Muncie and Ball State. And I feel like that rift is less. I feel like there's probably lots of different reasons as to why. I think one of the big reasons why is that the downtown area has significantly developed. When I was from 2002 to 2010, it was tumbleweeds downtown. There was nothing to do downtown. We, as college students, never went downtown. We would occasionally go to the Mark, occasionally after we reached 21, but we certainly didn't go to the Mark because we wanted to meet anybody. Okay. And I think that it was probably so then that's one thing I noticed that when we came back in 2014, within those 4 years that I was gone, a lot had happened downtown. And, we had the Fickle Peach and the caffeinery opened up. And there was all this much cooler stuff that was happening downtown. And I feel like that probably, this rejuvenated downtown area, I feel like brought more of the students to the downtown area and kind of helped to create, help to decrease that rift and such. So I mean, in my undergrad, I was largely unaware of the Muncie gay population. I mean, obviously, I knew about the Mark, and I went to the Mark after I'd reached 21, but I didn't really know a whole lot of Muncie gay people and was not really all that aware of them. And so I feel like the Muncie gay community is a little bit more out than they used to be. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm curious. I know that you moved to Arizona, and with your husband and your partner at that time. How did you see the differences between the Tucson LGBTQ community and the one in Muncie? Was it very different? Were there any striking differences between the two?
Yeah. How to describe it, I guess. The the Tucson gay community was sort of, from what I understood, I feel like the Tucson gay community was largely perceived as being some sort of subset of the Hispanic community. When you would go to the gay bars, and there were a few in Tucson, it was very, there's this a high level of like Hispanic population at the gay bars, right? There was a lot of Hispanic drag queens, right? And you would go and they would be playing music and people would be dancing and they were always dancing to Mexican music. And I don't know where the white gays went. I mean, there's certainly plenty of white people in Tucson, okay? I mean, obviously there's a large Hispanic population in Tucson, but I mean, there's plenty of white people. And so I don't know where the white gays went. They weren't at the bars. They must have been having house parties of their own. I just felt like the whole, it's almost as if being a homosexual in Tucson was somehow just some other subset of the Hispanic population. And that somehow just made us all the much more seedier, or perceived as being seedier. Yeah.
And I'm curious to ask you along that line as well. Do you see different people of diverse backgrounds represented in the Muncie LGBTQ community?
No, no. Um, I think like the African American population of Muncie, isn't it like 10%? I think it's supposed to be like around 10%. So I know it is, it's not like Chicago where it's a much higher percentage, right? Or some other city that has a much higher percentage. There are not many LGBTQ people who are African American in Muncie. I mean, there are, but obviously they're not out. Okay, I really don't know that many. So there is definitely the queer people of Muncie who are out and who are involved in the community are primarily white. And it's certainly noticeable. I volunteer at Muncie Outreach. And you go to the Mark, there's not a lot of Black people at the Mark. You Muncie Outreach, those kids, um, there might be one or two. If you had like 40 kids show up to Muncie Outreach on a Friday night, there might be one or two of them that are not white. Um, so as far as like racial diversity, no, not really, no. And why is that? Like, okay, obviously, oh, well, there just aren't any gay Black people in Muncie. Well, that's not true. Obviously there are. They're not out, or they're not involved with the mainstream gay community. um, I perceive it as a problem, um, from as a volunteer at Muncie Outreach. uh, would love to have more of the kids involved, if that were not white. That would be really great. And certainly with the volunteers, we do have a couple volunteers who are not white, and we want the volunteers to represent a diverse background, so that way, should on occasion that Black kids show up, they're not talking to only white volunteers. That would be very unfortunate.
Yes. And I was curious, you brought up the Mark III, and I know that you currently work at the Muncie Public Library and have done extensive research on its history. And I was curious, when did you first start researching the Mark III tap room?
I was looking in the paper and I found out that they had celebrated their 50th anniversary. And that must have been like in 2017. Gosh, I should know. I have terrible memory. No, it was 2019. I knew it because they opened up in 1969. So that was their 50th anniversary. And I'm like, this is wonderful. This should be, no, they opened up in 1968. So 2018 was their 50th anniversary. And I'm like, so this should be something. They should do something about it. And after I read that, I was like, and there was sort of something in the air at the library. There was another person who was working at the library. And when I started doing the Mark History Project, she was also doing a history project on Berg Warner. And so the library has a Berg Warner history project that has been going on. And so I think there's YouTube videos and presentations that have been given at the library about Berg Warner, the car plant that used to exist here in Muncie, and was a big institution here in town. A lot of memories there, big part of local history. And so those two projects sort of kicked off around the same time. And that person and I were having lots of conversations. So it was in the air. I don't exactly remember who started what first. But I felt that, okay, so they've been around for 50 years. That means that 50 years ago, there was enough gay people in town to warrant an interest in such an establishment, And so this was before Stonewall. So who were these gay people in 1968 that were living in Muncie? I desperately want to know. I'm just shamelessly nosy. And who the hell were they, and how did they identify themselves, and what did they do? How did they party? How did they meet people? I really could not know too much about them. I got with Sarah, who is head of the history local genealogy branch at Muncie Public Library, and the two of us started working on that. That would have been in 2019.
That's very exciting. And going along with that, I was curious, what has been done so far with the research? I know that you interviewed the owners currently. Would you mind speaking to who the owners are and what the research has involved?
The current owners are Natasha and Keith Martz. They are a father-daughter. They are the owners. On most nights, I'm sure you will find Natasha there as a bartender. So we did a bunch of interviews, and there was a presentation that was given at the Mark. We were going to do a presentation at Carnegie, but it got canceled because of COVID. I know we were able to do a presentation at a history class that Emily Johnson had. So we did the presentation there. And the presentation was also made into a YouTube video. And so if you go to the Muncie Public Library YouTube, you can watch it there. We have plans to continue to interview more people. We just haven't been doing it over the last 10 months because of COVID. And the library has kind of there was a couple months there that we were closed, and we're sort of working half days, part-time there. And so we're kind of only fulfilling essential functions right now. So no, we haven't been, I'm assuming that, if things ever do go back to normal, we'll conduct more interviews and we will kind of continue. We also kind of reached a dead end in some ways because we were able to get lots of information from the 80s and the 90s, but up to the current day. But the 70s, that whole 70s, I have not really been able to find anybody to talk to. A lot of those people are deceased. There's a lot of lost information that just cannot be found. So I guess I'll never know who these gay people were in 1968. I want to say that most of the people, I think the earliest account that I've been able to get out of somebody was somebody who was there in the late 70s, maybe 1979, 78. So what were they doing from 68 to 78? I don't know.
I'm curious, do you know who founded the Mark III?
His name is Ralph Hannon, and he is still alive, as my understanding. But he's sort of recluse. And I've been given phone numbers to contact him, and I have called him. Sarah, my partner in this, has called him, and we have left messages, and he does not call us back. And so I don't know what the situation is there. I don't know. He's still alive. He was really young when I think he started it.
And I'm curious, can you tell me a little bit more about the history of the Mark III? I know it was established in 1968. What did the timeline look like, and when did it switch to Natasha and the new owner's possession?
Right. Well, I don't have those notes. I would refer you to the YouTube video because that would show you everything and that would give you all the dates. off the top of my head, well, Ralph Hannon founded it. It was founded in '68, and it was him and another person. God, what was that person's name? Can't remember. And they got a liquor license and they started the Mark III. One of them was saving up money to buy a car, and there is a car that is called a Mark III. Okay, and you can look up pictures of it. This 1968 black, it's sort of like a Chrysler. Like you can almost, like, there's a little bit of a fin on the back of the car. It's certainly coming out of the fin era, right? This a huge land boat, God knows it was probably getting 15 miles to the gallon, you know, and they were going to buy it, and instead they used the money to get the bar. And so they named it the Mark III instead. So there was no Mark I, there was no Mark II. Okay, as far as a bar, and it was on. What's the name of that street? It's not Walnut, where they are now. They were in a different location, and I think they were there for about a year, and then they moved to the location that they were at for years and years, which I think is Adams. I think it's on Adams is where they were for years and years. And that is where the Mark was when I was in my undergrad. And it's like a shoebox of a little building, right? And on the YouTube video, you will see that we have a Sanborn map of the building. And so Ralph Hannon owned it, and it had passed through several different hands, and there were times when it was, only open on weekends. It kind of fluctuated, and it didn't always have drag, but I feel like drag is very much important to the history of the Mark, because when the Mark was doing well, it was doing well because there was drag shows. Okay. And so those owners who didn't invest in drag shows did not see the good times of the Mark, the highest, most successful times of the Mark. And I think if you were to speak to Natasha, she would tell you that it's the shows that bring people in. And so they have drag shows, they have drag king shows, they have burlesque shows, they do other things there. And it passed through several different hands, and then it was endangered of being closed. Natasha bought it, and the guy who owned the building was, I think, forcing them out, and they were closed for a few months there for a while, and then they reopened at their current location, and that was like a grand opening, and they seem to have been doing well since then.
I'm curious, when did you first go to the Mark, and when did you first learn about it?
I think I always knew. There was another gay bar in Muncie. I need to travel and plug in. Wait, I can do it from here. I gotta plug in, 1 moment.
No worries.
I want to say that there was another gay bar that was called Confetti's. Oh. There's been other gay bars in Muncie. There was another one, and I didn't know about this one until I was researching the Mark. There was one bar that was called the Alcazar. That building is no longer currently standing. The Alcazar was in a building where the Mitz bus station is now. So before the Mitz bus station was there was another building, and that building got demolished, and the Mitz bus station was later placed there. And then there was another bar that was called Confetti's. I don't even know where Confetti's was. I think Confetti's closed when I was 20. I don't think I was 21. So that was probably like in 2003 when Confetti's closed. And I don't know much about it. I always just kind of knew that there was a bar called The Mark. And so I don't remember the first time I went, but I mean, I was probably 21, obviously. And I think the reason why I didn't make a huge impression on me is because I had been going to gay bars elsewhere long before then. I was living in Ohio when I was 18, and in Ohio, you can get into most bars. You just can't drink until you're 21. And so I was going to huge gay bars, multiple floored gay bars when I was 18, 19 years old. So walking into The Mark at its old location when I was 21 years old was not impressive to me. The bars I was going to in Columbus, the bathroom is as big as the actual Mark at the time, you know. So anyway, I can't really tell you much about my first. I would go with some friends, and it was just, I don't know. I guess after going to house parties for so long, it's like, why should I pay these prices to drink? And as being an executive member of Spectrum, I was really sick of drag shows, just really tired of seeing drag shows. And so not really interested in seeing a drag show, not interested in paying this much money to drink. I have to say, my 20s at The Mark was not very memorable, but I remember going on occasion.
And I'm curious, I know you mentioned several gay bars in Ohio. What were the names of those and where were they located?
Well, Columbus, Ohio has this little neighborhood that's informally referred to as Short North. I want to say that its actual name is called the Italian Village. I think that's what it's called. There's all these. Columbus has all these. There's a German village. There's an Italian village. There's Clintonville. There's all these little, like, I don't know if they were townships or what. So you have High Street that runs north south through Columbus, and there's the river that goes across it. And anything south of the river, directly south of the river, is the downtown area. That's where the Columbus Convention Center is, the Ohio Convention Center is. That's where all that is. And then once you cross the river, you are now in Short North, that short section before it moves on forward north, and then you join in the Clintonville. And that little stretch is sort of Gayville. Short North is it's like the Castro. It's like this little gay neighborhood. And most of the bars and restaurants and shops and everything that's there is certainly very gay friendly. And it's through Short North is where they have the Gay Pride Parade every year and all that stuff. So those bars, so that whole neighborhood, like we would go there like every weekend. And so that whole neighborhood is pretty much like one giant gay bar. And there was one place that was called, damn it, what the hell was it called? It was this restaurant that we used to go to that was sort of like, it was like a bar restaurant. Can't remember its name. If I think long enough, it had television screens everywhere. So we would go there and we'd have dinner because they served food, and we would eat food and hang out for a little while, and we'd sort of pregame there. And then usually like around 10, 11 o'clock, we would then leave and walk down the street a few blocks, and we would go to this other bar called Axis, AXIS, which I think is probably still there. Okay. Do you know, is it still there?
I'm not quite sure. I'm curious to look after the interview if it's still
Right.
standing.
It's still there. And that was a huge bar. That was a huge bar. And it had like a mezzanine and everything. And lots of shows there, and would we just go there and dance and such. And they had like a little outdoor area where you could hang out. And so we did that. And then, so then you would stay there until like, till like 2 o'clock in the morning. I think they would officially close at 2:30. And then there was another bar that was called the Millennium. And all three of these bars were owned by the same people. That first bar, whose name I can't remember, where I would eat dinner, Axis, and then the Millennium, was all three owned by the same people. There was this gay couple that were like the gay godfathers of Columbus. I think I may have seen one of them at one point, and they were, I want to say one of them, okay, their names was Bob and Rajesh, and they were a couple. And I think Bob was older and was a retired police officer. Okay. And they owned this. They owned these bars. I would assume that they were probably extraordinarily shallow, upper middle class gay men. God knows they were probably terrible people. And so the Millennium would be open, and the Millennium you could go, and there was no alcohol served at the Millennium. And so that's like the after hours bar. And so that would be open from like 2 o'clock until like 6 o'clock. And you could go there, and if you went to Access and you got one of those armbandy things, you could go to the Millennium and they'd let you in at a cheaper rate. And so then you go to the Millennium, and it was so bizarre because it's just more Access. It's just more like dance music and people dancing, and they're serving like instant oatmeal in like little cups, those little instant oatmeal cups. And they had granola bars and Gatorade and Red Bull and coffee and juice. Okay. They're like serving like continental breakfast food. Okay. Um, and, uh, and, you know, it never really ended. Okay. I'm also forgetting another place. There was another place downtown. There was another place in the short north called Coffee Table. That was a coffee house. And so I forget, we would start at the coffee house, and we would hang out there in the early evening. And it was hilarious because it was on a corner, and people used to sit outside, and people would drive down the street and make that turn ever so slowly, right? People are literally cruising. People are literally getting in their cars and driving that corner and looking at all of us sitting outside and determining whether or not they want to come and talk to any of us, right? It is a meat market. You are on sale. Absolutely. Okay. And you would see that kind of thing. And so the cruising never ended because you would be at coffee table, and then we would all go down to that restaurant, and then we would eat, and then we'd go to Access, and then we'd go to the Millennium. Okay. And then probably like around 5 o'clock in the morning, you would leave the Millennium, and there was I don't know if they still exist or not, but there was a chain of restaurants called TJ's. TEEJAY''S. There's like 2 or 3 of them around town. And it's sort of like a Bob Evans. It's sort of like a greasy spoon kind of thing, right? And so we would leave the Millennium about 5 o'clock, and then we would go to TJ's. And TJ, the closest TJ's, which at that day and time, when that would occur, would cease to be TJ's and be forever then referred to as Gay J's. And you would suddenly, all these drag queens and leather daddies and Go-Go Boys and Butch Dykes would all flood this TJ's, now known as Gay J's, and we're all sitting there eating breakfast at 5 o'clock in the morning, and it's hopping, it's full, and we're table hopping from booth to booth, okay? And the waitresses are just out of their minds running around trying to feed us all, and there we are eating pancakes and ham and eggs and what have you, and the cruising never ended, and it's sort of wholesome in a way that we're eating our biscuits and gravies and pancakes. It's like a gay Norman Rockwell painting, right? And we're just and then you would leave like at 6, 7 o'clock. You'd finally leave AM and go out into the parking lot, and they're still out in the parking lot talking to each other. God knows what nefarious things are going on in those cars, right? And so, I mean, this was how you did it. That you would go to coffee table, and the romance would begin. You would pick one out, and you got your eye on somebody, and then you go to the restaurant, you go to the Axis, and you start dancing with them. You go to the Millennium, you continue to dance with them. You go to Gay J's, you eat with them, and then finally you take them home,
It's a
right?
long night. That's a
It
long
is.
night.
Right. And when you're like 19, 20 years old, that's like a year-long relationship, right? Um, there. Um, yeah. I
And
had
I'm
to get out. I was 18 years old, and I was like, this is all really great, but I need to go back to school. Okay. I took that year off between high school and college, and I'm like, I could live here. And I worked at a Pizza Hut, right? I had a full-time job at a Pizza Hut. And I could just work here and party every weekend, and I would grow old and never go to college and make terrible life decisions. Yeah.
it sounds like it was a very interesting neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, going along with that, what do you see as the significance of the Mark III, given that it is one of, there were several other gay bars in Muncie, but the Mark III was one of the most long-standing. What do you see as its importance for the city?
You know, that's part of the reason why I started this research, is because this is an idea I had very early on. I was like, the research, the history project was sort of an afterthought. What I wanted to do was, okay, it's been there for over 50 years. We should get the mayor to, or the governor, to somehow designate the mark as some sort of historical monument. How do we do that? And I was thinking, well, we could do this history project and build a case for its importance. Um, so really, the history project was sort of a means to an end, I feel, in some ways. And so I think that the significance of it, um, is, it's how long it's been there historically, and how it sort of has changed through the years, and it's adapted. And in some ways, I feel that it is, to study the mark is sort of to study the changing of Muncie, and that you can see when the mark first began was the heyday of Muncie, and there were the population of Muncie was a lot higher than it is now. I would say before the factories left, when the population was larger, Muncie was perhaps more cosmopolitan and maybe even more liberal than it is today. Um, and there were we found out when we did the history project, there were a lot of adult bookstores in Muncie. Um, and I feel that the nightlife and adult nightlife was much more vibrant and accepting than it is now. And then you see all those factories leave, and so you see the bar suffer from that. The crowd gets smaller. Um, Times get more desperate. Um, what have you. And I think that when you see how Muncie has changed in the modern era, you can see the bar as being like a microcosm of that.
That's a
And with
wonderful way to put it.
and then when and it's like the bar is constantly there, and so when downtown suffers, the bar suffered, and then downtown starts to rejuvenate, and the bar moves to a new location and has a grand reopening. And so now downtown is doing, COVID aside, downtown is doing better than it ever was. And now the bar was doing better than it ever was. And so it's like the mark is like the mood ring of of uh, of the community in some ways.
That's a wonderful way to put it. And I was curious going along with that as well. I know that you were involved in the Pride event for 2020 in Muncie. And I was curious, what did that look like? How were you involved in the Pride celebration?
Well, the Pride celebration was online. I didn't have much of a hand in it. It was we had taken part, and there was all these meetings, and we were going to do all this stuff, and we wanted to have a week long of events, and we were going to have an outdoor picnic, and we were going to put up a big, I think we were going to put up like this big tent in downtown, and we were going to have like a history educational pavilion and have talks and things like that. And then COVID hit, and that really just decimated everything. And so everything had to go online. And then once it was decided that we were going to go truly virtual with the entire thing, um, the amount of people who were involved decreased. And I was one of those people. So I wasn't too involved in the end. Sarah and I made the YouTube video, and we made sure that it was available during that week of events as sort of like a side item.
And I'm curious to ask, I know that you've traveled around the country. What is the importance of having a Pride event in Muncie?
I probably have very different opinions about pride than a lots of other people do. I feel like a lot of people think of pride as being this extravaganza that needs to occur um, as a commercial opportunity and as a way of making sure that the community doesn't forget that we're here and such. And yeah, that's all very important. But I feel like, particularly with cities the size of Muncie, they often like to get competitive about the entire thing. And I feel like that's incredibly unnecessary. Pride should reflect the culture and community of its location. And so Chicago Pride has literally, it's a 4-hour parade. Okay. It's awful. It's terrible. It's mind numbing, you know. Um, and Indianapolis Pride is always, every year they're trying to get bigger and bigger, and they're trying to compete with Chicago Pride and other big cities. And it's just like, no, you don't have to do that. It's Indiana. Why can't we have a cornfield pride? Right. And then the same thing with Muncie. When we were doing Pride in Muncie, there were different opinions. There were some people who were involved with Pride that wanted to have an indie Chicago Pride. They wanted to bring in big name people. And you had some people who even were going so far as to say, we need to appeal to white gay men because white gay men have money and they will donate and give money. So we need to pick entertainment. We're talking about half-naked muscular men. We need half-naked muscular men at Pride, and we need to bring in that kind of entertainment so that way all of the well-to-do gay white men will come out and spend money. Otherwise, it's crap. And then the rest of us were sort of thinking, you know, I don't know why we have a university. We should try to show off our academia. We should try to show off our education in history. We have the Mark, the oldest gay bar in Muncie. And the oldest gay bar in Indiana. We need to show that off as well. And we have blue collar roots, right? And we need to show that off as well. And we also have a high population of gay families. You have a lot of mostly lesbian couples with children. Okay, so our Pride needs to be family friendly, right? It has to appeal to the youth and to young people
Yes.
and to their parents. Okay, and we have Muncie outreach, and we need to like get the kids involved. So yeah, we can't have Folsom Street. We just can't have guys in jock straps blowing each other in the alleys. Okay, and so that kind of, and I kind of felt like we needed to have that kind of folksy, and that's okay. Let Muncie Pride be Muncie, and stop trying to be Indy or Chicago. That's too expensive and it's unrealistic.
And it's
Uh,
not who you are.
and it's not who we are, and such. And I've always just felt like, if you were to go to Miami, if you were to go to Tucson, if you were to go to El Paso or San Antonio, you would expect, if you would go to New York Pride, you would expect these kinds of demographics appealing to these kinds of cultures and languages. But we're out here in Muncie. Let's have a cornfield pride, and such. I think we won out. I think our virtual pride I thought was really good. I was very very impressed with those people who were involved. They did a very good job working underneath those constraints. I think some of the people involved were very discouraged with themselves because they wanted this week long of events in person, and because of COVID we couldn't have that. But I mean, I think given the circumstances, I think they did an excellent job. And I guess we'll see what happens this year.
I'm looking forward to it.
I
I
hope I answered your question.
Most definitely. Those were all of my questions. I was curious in wrapping up, was there anything that I didn't cover that you wanted to talk about?
I can't really think of anything now.
Wonderful. And as a closing question, I was wondering, is there anyone that we should talk to for the project?
For this project,
Yes,
I mean, I'm assuming you're looking mostly at like Muncie local history.
mostly, yes. But we would be
Yeah.
interested in people in that area.
Yeah. I mean, you should definitely talk to Keith Martz. Okay. Keith grew up here in Muncie. You should definitely talk to Laura Janney, who runs Muncie Outreach. She's a very strong ally, but she, founded and is the director of Muncie Outreach, and she grew up here in Muncie. There is an interesting couple that's named Bill and Cindy Brighton. I believe it's Britton. They're an elderly couple that live here in Muncie, and he is like a retired social worker. Okay, and for several years they managed a home here in Muncie called the Aquarius House. And the Aquarius House, it's no longer there. it was sort of, the house was located sort of west of the downtown area. And it was sort of like this home where if you needed a place to sleep that night, you could sleep there that night. They also did like outreach where people would call them if somebody was having like a psychological episode or something like that. You had like a lot of people. This was probably like in the 70s and in the 80s, and so you had people who were Vietnam veterans, and you had people who were having bad acid trips and things like that. And they Bill ran lights for one night. He ran lights for a drag show at the Alcazar. Um, and they're both straight, but because of their working at the Aquarius house, they knew a lot of drag queens. They knew a lot of people in the gay community. And I think the Aquarius house could definitely be its own little history project if somebody wanted to take that on. Very interesting that this house existed. And you know, we talk about a restructuring of funds on how we handle policing and how we handle people who are having overdoses or people who are having mental health problems or something like that. And that maybe instead of calling the police, we should have healthcare professionals to help these types of people. That's what they were doing. Instead of calling 911, if somebody OD'd or if somebody was having like a psychotic breakdown or something, a psychotic episode, you would call the Aquarius house, and they were trained in first aid, and they would then come and assess the situation and help that person. And so that was happening here in Muncie in the 70s, you know. And so that eventually that institution lost funding. Um, and they could probably point you to some other people. I think Keith and Cindy and Bill would probably point you to other people. Um, there is another organization here in town. We have a steampunk consortium. I don't know if you're aware of them.
I am not.
You do know what steampunk is.
Yes.
Okay, so there is, and I guess it's more popular out west, but there are like it's a social group. Okay, and before COVID, they probably existed for several years now, but before COVID, they were meeting once a month, and for a while they were meeting at Books and Brews, um, over by the river,
Yes.
and they dress up in their steampunk outfits, and they kind of come and they hang out, and that the as like a whole raison d'etre of that organization is to celebrate steampunk, sci-fi, fantasy, eccentricity in living. But the founder is a gay man, and the group is very much dedicated to creating a safe space for LGBTQ people and also people who are dealing with mental illness. And so they sort of advocate for mental health awareness issues and also advocate for queer people. And so it's a very like cool space to go to. And I think that if you were to go to and talk to those people who run it and those people who take part in it, then you would probably be meeting other people who've been living in Muncie and a part of the queer community for a long time.
That's wonderful. Those are wonderful leads moving forward. I wanted to sincerely thank you so much for participating in this interview for the Muncie LGBTQ History Project. It was so wonderful.
Thank you. I probably should mention another person. I should
Go
mention
ahead.
one person.
Yes.
Okay. Eleanor Trawick and Marky Oliver. Have those names been given to you before?
I've heard Marky Oliver, but I have not heard about Eleanor.
Eleanor and Marky are a couple. They've been married. They've been a couple for years. And They live over on Morrison. I know Eleanor because she was one of my music professors. Um, and so Marky was involved with the UU Church, and Marky is involved with um, Marky manages like a soup kitchen or something here in town. She does that type of stuff. And they've lived here for years and years. I remember when the whole gay marriage thing happened and was legalized. I think the Star Press married them because they were one of the first gay couples in Muncie to get legally married.
That would be interesting to follow up with them as well. I'll definitely, I just wrote their names down.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
sure.
Thank you so much for participating in this interview for the project. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but it was so wonderful talking to you.
Sure.